Right, okay, so, kia ora, my name's Simon McCullum, just Simon McCullum, and so I'm teaching at Victoria University. I also teach in NZGDC Wellington in Norway, and I was an extra in Lord of the Rings, and when preparing this talk, I suddenly realised that, in fact, I had been radicalised, because as a wild man in Lord of the Rings, Saruman was radicalising me. Right? Because he created the Rohirrim as my enemy. He talked about my grievances. He engaged my grievances, formed an army, and sent it against the Rohirrim. So in fact, being a wild man is probably my closest experience of being radicalised myself. And you don't need the audio. People have heard it before. Oh, you need me for the audio. Okay, sorry. They need me to think. So, in this talk, I'm responding to both what's been happening for a while in the community and the things that have been happening recently. We've been a bit lucky with Charlie Kirk because the right wing in America have decided to call it a left-wing violence rather than deciding it was gang violence. Right? There are some who are still saying that it was caused by playing of computer games. So we have to be careful that we don't catch some flack from that whole angry universe, right? Because when we start talking about the pathways to extremism and how games are part of the community, and some members of our community also end up being radicalised and having extreme forms of violence, we as a community have to understand, are we playing a role? What can we do to help society in general? But also push back on the principle that it's we're doing the thing that makes this worse, right? So there's, and particularly when people start to look at regulating game communities and regulating game development, we as a community need to be in that conversation, right? We can't just leave it to sociologists and policy makers who don't understand gaming communities, don't understand game development, and have them regulate for us. So New Zealand has a special place, partly because of the Christchurch shooting and the Christchurch call, which Jacinda set up. That's given New Zealand an outsized voice in the discussion around extremism. So we, as a community, have an ability to help shape the international dialogue. So this work is part of a work for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which was set up several years ago to look at extremism. Now, when we look at the standard risk factors for people to be radicalised, they look like some of our members of our community. Right? These are male-gendered, social isolation, perceived injustices, low agreeableness, so that's in the big five, where you've got the 5 personality traits. Agreeableness is one of those, as well as neuroticism, but agreeableness is the one that's linked to potential risks of being drawn into extremist behaviours. And the polarisation of society and the polarisations within our communities help radicalise some of our players. So, when you look at those toxic players are hurting our communities as well. A survey recently was 60% of players spend less in a game because of the toxic community of other players. 60% have quit a game because of toxic other players and receiving hate. And 70% will avoid playing a game or buying a game because the community in that game is perceived as toxic. Right? So certainly there is not just a helping society aspect to this, there's also a business aspect that we need to get better at this. Interestingly, the survey, which I found slightly counterintuitive, males are more likely to reduce engagement because of hate and harassment. And that sounds weird, right? Because we know that usually women are the victims of hate and harassment in games. Right? So why do men respond sort of more viscerally and remove from game? It seems to be, and the justification research is, that women who are playing games have processes and have built resilience to manage that, and so receiving hate in a particular game doesn't make them feel much worse about that game because they just see it as normal across the community, so that game isn't a problem. Whereas if a man gets hate in a game, he goes, oh, that's weird, I'm not going to go back there, and plays all the other games which are nice to him, right? So yes, men are more sensitive to it, partly because we probably are not as immersed in a community that gives that pushback. One of the interesting comments we had from attendees was also the sense that women will often play as men to be invisible and to level the playing field, whereas men who sometimes play as women are looking for the advantages of being a woman in that environment, because if there is harassment, they can just step out of that role and step back into their normal role, right? So they're using it as I'm going to see if there's anything I can extract from this game by playing as woman, and so it's a very different motivation to play cross-gendered roles. One of the things when we look at expanding moderation efforts, resilient building, community managers, it's the community managers that have the largest effect on how these communities evolve around your game, right? So actually working on supporting community managers seems to be something that hopefully decreases the toxicity in communities, and the less toxic you are, the less likely you are to be able to be drawn and have a wedge placed between you and the rest of the community. There's a lot of theory on this. So Axelrod did some research back in the 80s and 90s on the number of defectors you need in the community before it starts disintegrating that community. And by disintegrating it, it's do you make a trusting first impression? Right? When you first interact with another player, are you likely to be trusting and assume that that player will be kind back to you? Right? Now, and the research says about 10%. If 10% of people are assholes in your game, people will start to assume that the interaction will be negative and will therefore start with a negative interaction, which means your community starts to degrade into a zero trust, everybody's out for themselves, right? And so he run this across multiple simulations with different player types and different interaction types. So we need to keep, if we're going to keep our societies and our communities well, we need to do the right kind of gardening to try and keep that community above 90% generally interacting positively. There are, of course, issues with player-generated content, and also when you allow a game platform like Roblox. So the Australian police were looking through and they found, of course, Nazi and German concentration camp simulators in Roblox. I had a very strange experience of working with a Swedish social scientist who built an Auschwitz simulation in Minecraft for social studies, so he could take his kids on a field trip to Auschwitz. The thing that disturbed me, well, two things. One, he had working gas chambers and incinerators, so you could turn the lever and turn the incinerator on, and I thought, well, that's going a bit far in the simulating Auschwitz. And the activity he had was you decorated the guard's room. So in Minecraft, you went in and added the furniture to the guard's room. And I think this is not, you seem to be associating with the wrong type of feeling you should have. It is also really weird to play Minecraft Auschwitz, because you get that cognitive dissonance of creative Minecraft with horrific genocide. So we also see the re-education camps, we see the Islamic State. People use tools to build the things that they want to share, right? And you can get very toxic content. When you look at white supremacists and extremism, this was a survey in 22 around people who are being exposed to white supremacy in games. And this, as you can see, there's a range, it's just actually pretty much a standard range of popular games, right? It's not like you think, oh, one particular genre really jumps out as me as being the really horrific one. No? And you do see white supremacy popping up with Roblox in the adults and in the 12 to into 13 to 17. But you also see a bit of like, okay, so we do have Grand Theft Auto in our 10 to 12-year-old range, which is, the content itself is already potentially a problem. Now, one of the things we have is that if you make regulations and you push people outside of the rules, so they're 10-year-olds playing Grand Theft Auto, they can't say that they're 10-year-old playing Grand Theft Auto because they're already breaking the rules. Right? And once people are breaking rules, you then expose them to all the other things that are on the other side of that rule. Right? And so actually the harder you make that boundary, the more likely you are to push people into the darker parts of the internet and the darker parts of social media. So when you see this, it's not just the, oh, they're orange games, but it's also, oh, there are 18 games in there. What do we deal with people who are already breaking the rules, right? Because you have to be very careful how you manage those bans, how you manage gardening your community. And so we need to have some of that layered response, right? So we need to have the warnings, we need to set up potentially layered access. One of the things that comes out of the research is a suggestion that actually gender supporting areas, so having areas that are female only areas, is a useful feature. It does create a safer space. It's not that you should only have female areas. You have them as a separate space and people can move back and forth, but you try and create safer environments when people choose to access those areas. And we're looking for ways to modify behaviour. So we can look at how big a scope a ban might have and how big a scope rewards might have. So as game designers, we're not just interested in the scope of bans, we're also interested in how we promote pro-social behaviour. One of the biggest challenges of promoting pro-social behaviour among young people, as we had with one of my PhD students who was looking at cognitive behavioural therapy for young people and games, is that they're very sensitive to cringe. Right? If you put positive messages in and they detect that you're trying to patronise them, that has a really disconnecting effect and they go, oh, nah, not interested, that's just cringe. Yeah. Right? And so anything where we try and positively signal, we also have to kind of watch out that we don't get into the patronising side of things. But so looking at ban scopes, if you have like a whole sort of count-wide bans on things, that's like maximally challenging. You're kicking people out of a whole community. And if you have game-specific or feature-specific or particular server bans, right? So you have different levels of bans and different amount of control. Some of these need to have those escalation systems. Some of them aren't particularly responsive to the escalation systems at the moment, where you make complaints, nothing happens because it's not in the interest of the level of community that you're trying to get someone banned around for them to actually ban a particular player, right? So we need to kind of work out as a community how we manage the scope of limiting behaviours and communication types. We also have to look at the duration of bans and do you have a pathway back? Because if we tend and ban and garden very effectively our community, what happens to all of those weeds that were pulled out of this community and then pile up over here? How do we rehabilitate those people? Whose job is it to allow those back into society? How do we make sure that we actually have pathways to re-engage? Now that currently isn't, and I don't think it should be, game developers' job to rehabilitate society. Actually, we, like the wider society, needs to work out what kind of resources and what kind of approach we have to people who start getting removed from caring game societies and get pushed into the dark parts of social media. Right? So part of what I'm looking for in terms of discussion with government is that, yes, game communities are actually incredibly supporting communities, right? And we have a lot of people who will be supportive. But if we suddenly have a flood of toxic people come in, it will destroy the good we have. So we need to find those ways of rehabilitating people. So that's also what I'm kind of trying to work out. So if I move quickly through, so we looked at how do we rehabilitate, what happens in the shadows, what are the problems. Now, I'll screen through some of this because I want to get some questions at the end. There is a relationship between good game design and good extremism, right? So good extremism approaches where you can take those vulnerable people and make them feel welcome in your community and give them a shared opponent and make them feel engaged and give them agency and give them that sense of belonging and give them that sense of competence. Like, actually, you can recruit people using good game design techniques, right? Which is a bit of a worry that, you know, we're probably if you wanted to radicalize people, you are probably the best people in the room to form armies of radicalized people, because you are the best at designing those tools. I would prefer you not to use your powers for evil, but it also will help to understand when policymakers and when the police are trying to understand the pathways to extremism. Actually, some of our community might have the best way of understanding the behavioural techniques being used by extremists to engage our community. Right? So there is a potential for us looking at saying, well, if the police are trying to look at what's happening, engage with game designers because they understand a lot of these mechanisms and they're not already opposed to police forces. Right? So it's we have a talent that we should potentially be sharing. Now, in the workshop, and I'll quickly go through this, I used self-determination theory as my model for motivation. So this is agency, competence, and relatedness. I've added curiosity and creativity, which don't exist in the normal model, but are very much game community things. Of course, I also talked about those as being collectivist cultures. So in Western European cultures, we tend to think of them as individual buckets. So competence, you're good at something, and that's enough. Whereas if you look at Tau Māori, Mana Hamata Haki, Pamanawa, and Manaki tend to be a unified bucket where you're supposed to trigger all three, because if you don't trigger all three, the motivation leaks out through the others. Right? So it's a similar model, but with sort of broader connections. And of course, we have issues where coercion, imposter syndrome, othering leaks out those motivations. Right? And if you get banned or sent away and othered in your community, that is demotivating, right? And so if someone else welcomes you in, that feels good, right? And it's motivating to join that community. Unfortunately for us, universities tend to be a terrible thing for creativity. Some universities are okay, but you know. And also just telling people just because if they're curious, terrible for motivation. I also used my 6 animal model in the workshop, which is a way of managing communication. If you're interested, I use the self-determination theory and I make people role-play communication roles. This is a way to try and get people to be more interactive and communicate better. So we use those 6 animal roles, and if people are interested, they can come and ask me, how did you do that? I think the people in the workshop found it useful and interesting. Some didn't use it at all, because they were talking too much. But it does provide a framing for conversations, and it also allows you some cognitive distance from what you're talking about. And when we start talking about extremism and triggering behaviours, sometimes you want to have a cognitive separation between the topic and yourself. So what were the options? We had 4 options. We only covered 2 of them because we only had 2 groups. So we're looking at how do we help community managers, what a policy looks like, do we do pro-social design? How do we improve the design of things? And what are the sort of critical analysis and what values we can bring from game design into the analysis of the extremist pipelines? So all interesting topics, but we looked at tools for community managers was one group, and they focused in, because I get them to do a target, they focused on what they described as edge trolls or edgy trolls, which were people who are responding to being trolled, right? So rather than trying to support people who are being victimized by trolls, right? If they are just kind of doing the whole I don't like that, you support them, but you support them in a different way. Those people who are on the edge of having been trolled, they're going to troll other people, right? So you want to kind of short circuit the propagation of trolling in response to trolling. Right? And so they're looking at, okay, how do we identify that? How do we build the systems to stop that escalation? And one of the ideas that was being discussed was this idea of can we create ways of badging people, ways of identifying that you are doing things like helping other players, stopping the cycle where when you detect, and you could potentially use either AI systems or reporting systems where someone's been trolled and they haven't negatively responded back, right? Maybe there's a way you can go and thank that person and praise them and see this as a, yeah, that was great. You did a really good job. We understand that that person trolled you. We'll deal with it, but you were really good that you didn't escalate, right? And we really appreciate that as a community. So it's kind of finding those edge cases where you're trying to stop that propagation. We also look at, if you have these badges, can we give you that recognition across communities so that you're seen as someone who is valuable in the community because you bring the temperature down, right? And valuing and recognizing that. And also some de-escalation training for community managers. My experience is that many of our community managers come from a social media and comms and influencer space because they're really good at connecting with communities. But connecting with communities is very different to managing toxic behavior within a community. And so they come in because they have skills at outreach, but they don't get the support to become counsellors, right? And so there needs to be potentially some additional ways of providing that education. So that's something I'm going to have to look at with potentially Christchurch and some other universities to work out, can we work out a good de-escalation community training environment for community managers to help them understand some of those psychological techniques, right? And can we wrap that up in a way that's going to be, useful for the game industry as an additional educational offering, and potentially see if we can get that funded for free from government to say, hey, we want to support this like we would support community workers. We're going to provide free education in de-escalation and community management, right? So hopefully that might be an interesting thing that I'm going to use this time to kind of explore. The other one was a policy analysis, and they quickly focused in on education, because if you can build pro-social behaviours young, hopefully we can have that keeping going, and identified that doing things in curriculum is a bad idea because you get a change in government and they throw out the previous curriculum and bring in a new curriculum, or you try and change something in curriculum and all the parents notice, and at least some subset of the parents get very angry that you're trying to teach their children something they don't want their children to learn. However, cleverly, if you sneak in through teacher education and you change the attitudes of teachers, that survives various political shenanigans, and we upskill our teachers on understanding the games and game engagement and engagement to extremism and those pathways. And so we train teachers and we provide resources to schools for some of this de-escalation and management of extremism. There was also, and there are a lot of suggested policies. Some of these I'm quite concerned about. One that I saw, and when I was analysing things, and I also asked AI to analyse some of this stuff to see what it thought of it. AI suggested one of the more terrifying things that I saw, which it said, you're in New Zealand. You have this government-funded game developer rebate. How about you leverage that and force game companies to manage extremism, or else you won't fund them? And I thought, holy, don't let anyone outside the room know that, because that would be a terrible thing to do. But, if you just let policymakers apply AI to these policies in New Zealand, that's what they're going to be getting out of ChatGPT, right? So we potentially need to cut that off early, knowing that might be an option. We need to provide, no, that's terrible for this reason, and this reason, right? So we need to respond to these potential regulations from us as a community to make sure that we don't get those bad results. So, in summary, and I'll get the last takeaway questions, our players are vulnerable. Partly, some of them come to play our games because their community isn't satisfying their needs, right? So we are an area that makes our players healthier. But because they are already vulnerable, they are still exposed to potential extremism and potential drawing in there. We need to support our community managers, because it seems good community management seems to be the best way to slow down some of these risks. We need to improve education. and we need to be part of that discussion on regulation. And the last takeaway question, which I'm still not sure of, and I'd really love anybody to help me with, is how do we manage rehabilitating people? How do we bring them back in? Because I don't believe it falls on our heads as game developers to risk our communities by letting toxic people back in. But how do they re-enter society if we don't offer some sort of halfway house back from extremism? Is this something we need social workers paid for by government to create halfway house communities that allow people back to our very supportive gaming communities? Thank you. And do we have like 1 minute, 5 minutes for questions? Right, so any questions, thoughts? Does anybody know who should be rehabilitating? Anyone putting a hand up to be the you know, it's a no. Okay, so yeah.
It's Tish Lobster, I don't know her last name. Patricia Lobster. She's working on a game system which actually is with prisoners, and it teaches a whole lot of stuff about emotional regulation. So I guess, like, kind of, in some ways, I think the flip side of that question is how do we use games to motivate good behaviour rather than, like, that prevents people from being banned in the first place, almost?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of games in that space, and in those communities where you've got prisoners, you can have a system to engage and motivate them, right? Because they're already in a challenging scenario. What they've found from a bunch of people working in this prevention of violent extremism, they'll make games and then nobody plays those games, right? Because they feel preachy, right? And it might be some of those prisoners feel that the game is preachy, but they don't really. It's the best game available to them, right? And actually, I get away with a lot at university because I only have to be better than the other lecturers. I don't actually have to be better than the internet. And that was one of our big problems in COVID, is that suddenly everyone was online and lecturers had to compete against your best streamers. And all of us look terrible, right? And so, yes, if you can constrain the environment, then you can potentially get people to play the best option. Anna. Oh, good. I love provocation.
So you said that female-only spaces were really helpful. Were trans females included in those spaces as in the research? In the research,
it didn't say what their rules around transgender identification. As far as I could see, they were only using identified as female, right?
Right.
And then they would have a very early ban and a very user-generated banning from those spaces. So
the community were able to...
The community can very easily ban you from a female space, right? The normal community space, you have to escalate to a mod, and the mod's bans from the normal community, but in the escalated female-only community, you basically allow all of them to veto anyone. So once you're out, it's hard to get back in because you then have to prove yourself. But initially, it was more just identify as female and you're in until you do anything wrong and then you're immediately out.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
So you mentioned community members improving more effective. How do we know that is more effective, and what is that compared to, like, as opposed to what other things?
Yeah. So I'll repeat so the stream can hear. So the question was how do we know that community managers are actually helping the situation and actually are beneficial? I haven't seen evidence that training the community managers makes them much more effective. What I've seen is having community managers is better than not having community managers, right? So communities that have no mods or poor mods tend to have much more toxic comments, and the rate of toxic comments and toxic behaviour is larger than in moderated communities and having dedicated mods decreases the rate at which you see toxic behaviour and toxic comments or those sort of things, right? So I haven't seen them justify that training people to be better at that job has actually made them better at that job. that's an assumption I'm making, and I'd like to try out with people that, the anecdotal evidence would be that, the toxic behavior, if you are in a community manager and you're constantly being exposed to toxic behavior, you need a support structure as well, right? Because otherwise you burn out, right? And so we know from general counselling, we should be doing the training and we should be supporting these people because they are exposed to the toxic behaviour in the community and they are having to manage it and they're needing to de-escalate. And the better they are at that, the safer they are and the better our communities. Cool, right? I think we're all done. Thank you very much, and you can come and ask me questions. Cool, and a bunch of resources if people need them. So,